So here we are at a yoga conference, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what I think yoga might be able to do for us in our lives, and especially at a time in the world where there is so much fragility and instability. Last month, while I was in Montreal at the Zen Poetry Festival, which is a wonderful event in Montreal, the day I got there, an earthquake ripped a hole in the earth just off the coast of Japan, 400 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers long. And then a tsunami came and devastated many coastal towns. And part of the tragedy in that horrible and devastating incident was not just an earthquake and a tsunami, but its effect on the human-built world, and then the human-built world's effect on sentient beings. All kinds of, we mostly hear about humans, but there are a lot of beings that are alive, that feel the effect of what's going on, especially as we all watch Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant and reactor number 3 that's still in trouble. And as soon as the earthquake hit the nuclear reactor, 50, what the New York Times called the Fearless 50, which later the media started calling the Faceless 50. 50 men volunteered to stay at the plant and to put their lives at risk to keep the plant cool. And helicopter pilots flew right into the steam on top of those plants to dump seawater and chemicals to keep the plants cool. This I am going to suggest tonight, along with what we're seeing in many countries, especially in the Middle East, is a practice of yoga. To be able to serve in this way, to benefit other beings. The word yoga comes from the Sanskrit root yuj, which is a verb, which means to unite. And unfortunately, I think many people still think of yoga in the verbal sense as doing something. That yoga is to unite the mind and the body, or your body and movement, or whatever you imagine needs to be united. But the word yoga is not in its verb form anymore, when it's out of the form yuj. So yoga actually means united or union. I like to translate the term yoga as intimacy, the inherent intimacy of all things. That if you look closely, as physicists, as psychologists, as ecologists, or as anybody who looks closely will tell you, everything leans into everything else. You can't pick up anything in the universe without seeing everything else. We're in a hotel room, I just took a shower, I washed my face, and I'm aware of the water and how this water makes a long journey from, I don't know where it comes from in Halifax. Just up the street? Yeah. It comes through these pipes, it gets filtered, and it comes into my hands and onto my face. But you know, if I meditate really in that action to feel water on your face, which is a miracle just that you can open a tap and it comes out. Still so many places you can travel to not far from here. The taps don't just turn on with hot or cold water. And then to also contemplate how your face too is water, you know? And to feel as you massage your face, the sense that the face is also liquid, it's also water. And it's water, you know, massaging water. And then there's this me in there somewhere that gets constructed. And the me that gets constructed is a wonderful construction, but also because of our investment in its continuity and our belief in its superiority, we forget about this inherent intimacy in which we all live. So in an evacuation center just outside of Fukushima, so this is 18 miles away. This is before the first evacuation. The first evacuation was 10 miles, and then 20 miles, and then 30 miles. They say that the people within the 30-mile radius were receiving 400 millisieverts of radioactivity per hour, which is something like 1,000 times more than a worker at a Canadian nuclear power plant can receive in a year. And today I was reading in the New York Times that the International Atomic Energy Agency claims that many of these people who are within the 20-mile radius will die within the next 2 years. And there are still people volunteering to go do work there. So this is an act of service. And I think when we're in touch with interdependence, when we're in touch with intimacy, then the feeling grows in us to want to serve. And this is what I'd like to talk about in some detail tonight. So if yoga is a practice of intimacy, a practice of waking up to the interdependent reality that we live in, this is a little different than how we think of most spiritual traditions, I think. Because usually we think a spiritual tradition is a kind of vertical column that we enter into, where you step in and you wake up and turn on like a Christmas tree or something and shoot up into another sphere where you can remain unstained eternally. It doesn't include menopause or menstrual cramps or migraine headaches or pain even. Most of us think that to be awake or to have union with anything is to be intimate with pleasure. Right? To be intimate with something pleasurable. Well, according to the yoga tradition, the model is slightly different, which is to be awake to what's actually here in present experience. To be awake to your life. Not to your idea about your life, not to your theory about what life is, not to your ideas about other people, not to your ideas about your body, not to your ideas about what service is or isn't, but really to wake up to what's here and to act simultaneously. So outside of this 18-mile radius, there was an evacuation center, and my interest that day was to look at blogs coming out of Tokyo and see what people were saying. This was the news I was interested in. How are people serving? And I read one story that really touched me about an old man who came outside an evacuation center with his mask on and sat there. They describe him as staring at the ground. And I've been in one small earthquake in Los Angeles, but I've never been in a major earthquake. And I can imagine after several tremors that you would always be looking at the ground. And he's sitting there looking at the ground, and he turns to a high school student who's sitting beside him and says, "What do we do now?" And the high school student says, "Don't worry. We promise to fix it back. We promise to fix it back." And then the high school student reached over and started massaging this old man's back. Maybe the first step of that generation in fixing it back. How do you fix it back? Yeah. So I think so many times we're in our practice and we think it's just kind of solo. you know. And maybe we don't even examine the fact that we come to practice for ourselves. Although we may clothe it in the language of my hamstrings are tight, mostly we come to practice because we're unsatisfied. Because there's some feeling of lack or incompleteness that we all feel. Probably if you didn't feel some hint of this, you wouldn't be here tonight. Or maybe you wouldn't be so human. 80 years after the death of the Buddha, they started building stupas, or shrines. And different people would go hang out at different shrines. Kind of like some people go to Trident. Most people go to Trident, I think. I go to Trident anyways, but different coffee shops around town, you know. They're like certain kinds of stupas, you know. And so you go there as a kind of pilgrimage. And different kinds of people would hang out at these different stupas. And there was one stupa where the majority of the Sangha, which was in Sanskrit Mahasangha, would congregate. And mostly these were the non-monastics, lay people, people like you and I. And they would be interested in hearing of the Buddha's teaching, particularly his teachings on interdependence. This is what was debated, the scholars say, around this certain stupa. And eventually, they started looking around at the people who were close to the Buddha during the Buddha's lifetime, who were called arhats, or perfected beings. And they started watching their lives closely, which is what happens in community, and realized that maybe the arhats are not so perfect. They looked perfect at the beginning, but then maybe they were not so perfect, and all kinds of trouble broke out, particularly around how money was dealt with. And this larger Sangha broke away from the elders and created eventually what becomes Mahayana practice. And they came up with this idea that maybe everybody is working too hard trying to be a Buddha, trying to be a perfected person. Have any of you ever done this before? You know, try to be a perfect spiritual being. Many people attracted to practices like the one we're all doing here are perfectionists, you know, and we have a certain image of what we can become, and we are trying to work towards that, you know. And the problem with perfectionism is that the perfectionist really never wants to be perfect, because the game would end, you know.
The opinions expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of Eastlink TV, its sponsors, or partners.